Pemerintah menyatakan potensi energi baru terbarukan Indonesia cukup besar. Hal ini menjadikan investasi EBT Indonesia memiliki potensi yang cukup tinggi, terutama dari sektor pembangkit tenaga surya.
And what's the challenge of having this collective investment for development?
Actually, the energy transition is not one or two massive projects. It's hundreds of projects. It's upgrading people's houses. It's small-scale renewable energy. It's battery projects, particularly in Indonesia, which actually has access to international capital because of that investment grade rating. The question is more about getting and helping capital filter through from really, really big international funds onto the local level.
Untuk mendukung ekonomi hijau, OJK ini akan membentuk atau membuat sebuah aturan terkait dengan bursa karbon.
For the first 10 years of its life, Tesla did not make its money from selling cars. The way they made their money is basically taxed you for the emissions your cars produced. And so Tesla actually made all its money just from selling these emissions credits because their cars don't produce CO2.
Okay, hi everyone. We have a very special guest today. He's a lecturer in Harvard Kennedy School. My senior, Ely Sandler. Thank you for being here, Ely.
It's great to be here.
Such an honor for us. So, Ely, this is first year, I believe, for you teaching.
Yeah.
Financing
the clean energy transition.
And it's a very popular class. It's the second most subscribed class in Harvard Kennedy School. This spring, 179?
89.
That's crazy. That's huge amount of subscriptions. I didn't get to his class, but I audited online though. So, Ely, could you briefly tell us about your background, your education?
Yeah, sure. So I did my undergraduate degree in Oxford, in England. I studied something called PPE, which is politics, philosophy, and economics. It's a really interesting way of seeing the world through the political lens, economic lens, and then kind of what does that mean from philosophy. After Oxford, I went and worked in Morgan Stanley. I was there in total for about 9 years. Started in investment banking. This is around the time of the financial crisis. So the global financial system had collapsed, and it was an interesting time to start working in banking. I was basically structuring certain types of financial instruments to recapitalize the banking system. After Morgan Stanley, I, for a few years, worked in a business I set up building infrastructure in the Middle East. We worked in a few different places in the Middle East and North Africa, kind of climate-related infrastructure, things like water, agriculture, energy, and then I came to the Harvard Kennedy School.
Okay. Talking about climate, energy transitions, clean energy, this is something new for many people in developing countries. But what's interestingly is the number of subscription in your class tell you, it must tell about something, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things going on. When you and I were talking just now before we started the podcast, you said something that I found very interesting, which is that a lot of people in developing countries think of the global energy transition as something that developed countries have to do. Phasing out coal, moving from electric vehicles to, moving from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. And to some extent, this is true. If you look at the emissions per capita of Indonesia versus the United States, Indonesia has a fraction of the amount of emissions per capita. And if you look at the historical emissions of the world, the vast majority of CO2 that humankind has put into the atmosphere, huge majority, that comes from the global north. That comes from Europe, it comes from America, it comes from the Industrial Revolution. But at this point now, if you include China, the global south is more than half of world emissions. And so for me, the energy transition is not so much about decarbonizing developed countries. That is one big part. And America is doing all the things like the IRA and Europe is leading on carbon taxes. But actually what's exciting about it is it's really sustainable development. So the energy transition in developing countries doesn't mean making you consume less energy. It doesn't mean making Indonesia stop growing or stop being able to electrify the economy. Actually, it's about finding ways that energy use in Indonesia can increase without increasing emissions. And so it's a huge, I think, opportunity, and it's a carrot more than it is a stick, to build more renewable energy, to build more factories creating goods with green electricity. So I think the thing that matters, and maybe the reason that so many people were interested in this at Harvard, is that we've always been interested in development. And now we have a specific opportunity that the rich world really, really cares, not only about development in Indonesia and China and South America and wherever it is, but they care that it's done in a particular way. They care it's done sustainably. And that actually gives opportunities to places like Indonesia to access financing.
there's an interesting part in your final assignment in the canvas. You're talking about illustrious project financing, but with the negative IRR and or less than expected IRR of the investors and negative NPV. But I think even though it's illustrious, this is what really happening now, especially in emerging countries, isn't it? So how do you think policymakers should interfere?
Yeah, it's a great question. So just maybe one sentence of background. The way my course at Harvard is structured is that in the beginning of the year, beginning of the semester, all the students get a financial model. And I teach them how the financial model works. You've got basic principle of accounting. And the financial model, as you just said, has a negative return. So no one's going to invest in it. The project is terrible. And then what we do throughout the semester is we design policy instruments, be they subsidies or blended finance, which is when you give cheap loans or grants, tax breaks, this kind of thing, that slowly make this project investable for the private sector. And what investable for the private sector means is the cost of capital, which means how much you have to pay to borrow money. On your house, it's your mortgage rate. On a project, it's maybe the loan you get from a bank or the bond you take out from international investors. The cost of capital has to be lower than the return of the project, because the economic value of the project is basically you borrow at 10% and you get a return of 15%, you've made 5% on your money. And so there's two problems, I think, in developing countries. One is that the returns might be too low. This is maybe because the capacity of people to pay for electricity or to pay for goods is lower. The capacity of the state to subsidize projects is lower because they don't have as much money. But also the cost of capital is very high. And so if you remember that economic value is the difference between cost of capital and return, it's that, what you'd call a delta, that difference. If you have high cost of capital and low returns, this is the problem in emerging markets. And so the final assignment in my class is to get a new financial model. It's a solar field. And they have to either lower the cost of capital or increase the returns using policy instruments to make the project investable.
And in your paper, you're talking about how developed countries should interfere collective investment. For instance, instead of buying carbon carbon credits, they just collectively investing in more developing countries, right? But what's the challenge of doing that? Because if you take a look at developing countries, many of them not even met the credit scoring standard, investment grade, right? And political circumstances is also quite different compared to the global north. And what's the challenge of having that collective investment from developing countries?
It's a great question. So I think that when people talk about the energy transition, they tend to throw out a lot of numbers. And I don't want to throw out too many numbers, but I'm going to frame your question in terms of a gap of funding. Roughly speaking, if you look at all the different estimates for how much money is needed per year between now and 2030, for developing countries, it's a little bit over $2 trillion. So we want to get to $2 trillion more per year of investment. And at least half of that has to come from the global north. So in some places like India, you have a very, very developed local banking system, very, very developed local capital market. And this means you can take savings from citizens and consumers in India, and you can invest it in other places in India, and you kind of have a domestic investment ecosystem. A lot of places in emerging markets have a less developed financial system, or the country is not rich enough that they can channel domestic savings into productive investments. And so you need maybe $1 trillion per year, maybe a little bit more of cross-border investment. And as you said, one of the major ways that international investors look at opportunities is through this thing called credit ratings. Three big credit rating agencies, S&P, Moody's, Fitch, and they basically say, hey, you have an investment in Indonesia. It could be a big project, it could be a company. What do we as an independent kind of auditor of this project think is the risk? And the risk is very important because when you make an investment, as we know, the economic value is the difference between the cost of capital and the return. But you need that return to be kind of related to the risk. So the more risk there is in the project, the more return you need. And if these credit agencies or international investors more generally, they think that the projects are really risky, you need this return to be greater. And as we said, there's just not the capacity to generate that kind of return when you don't have government subsidies or you don't have the capacity of people to pay. And so for someone like Indonesia is investment grade. What this means in technical terms is that they have a BBB rating from the credit agencies. And so they actually do have some access to international capital. So they've sort of passed the first hurdle. There are a lot of countries that can't get any access to international capital. Indonesia actually has, but it's only for really big projects. Because if you're an international investor and you want to invest in Indonesia, you don't really know the local ecosystem. And so you need a project that's big enough, $500 million, $1 billion, to make it worth your while to understand the local ecosystem, to make it understand the risk. And so then you get the problem that actually the energy transition is not one or two massive projects. It's hundreds of projects. It's upgrading people's houses. It's small-scale renewable energy. It's battery projects. And so for me, particularly in Indonesia, which actually has access to international capital because of that investment grade rating, the question is more about getting and helping capital filter through from really, really big international funds onto the local level. And that's when either local Indonesian investors can be useful, Indonesian developers, or the government through policy.
From fossil fuel is only 1/3 of the renewable energy.
And then yes, you look at Indonesia, and Indonesia has what you could call a negative carbon price, meaning
Talking about the effectiveness of the policy by the government, I saw the slides. Like I saw Indonesians in your chart, the only country with a negative carbon tax revenues per tons compared to other countries. Well, but say because I'm Indonesian, I try to defend my country. I'll say that our country has been trying to push like subsidy in electric vehicles. But do you think this policy is quite effective in shifting to the clean energy transitions?
Yeah. So the slide you're talking about is, I mean, a lot of people have seen versions of it. It's what is the price of a ton of carbon that you have to pay in a country? And so an economist would tell you one of the most effective ways to encourage the energy transition, encourage renewable energy, encourage decarbonization, is to make people pay for CO2 they emit. The problem of climate change is basically that if you burn fossil fuels, you get all the benefit, you get energy. You don't have to pay for what people call the negative externality. You don't have to pay for the negative impact. And so putting a price on carbon can do two major things. First of all, it makes burning fossil fuels relatively less attractive because it's more expensive. And it can generate revenue that you can then put into decarbonization. Now, if you look at all the countries in the world, some are doing very well. Europe has a very high carbon price. It's really incentivizes decarbonization. US, middling. And then, yes, you look at Indonesia, and Indonesia has what you could call a negative carbon price, meaning they are actively subsidizing emissions of CO2 because of the fuel subsidies. One thing before I actually answer your question is this is kind of unfair on Indonesia because a lot of countries subsidize electricity, and the electricity is generated from fossil fuels. And so actually they are subsidizing fossil fuels. But because Indonesia directly subsidizes fuel, it kind of looks worse on this chart. But I think to answer your question, yeah, it is a very effective way of, in a vacuum, it would be a very effective way of decarbonizing an economy. There's a couple ways you can see this. I'll give you maybe two examples. The first is if you look at it's called the ETS, the Emissions Trading Scheme, which is the European version of the carbon price. The sectors, particularly in manufacturing, where the Europeans have a high carbon price, those sectors have decarbonized quicker. So basically it's obvious and it makes basic economic sense. You have to pay for carbon. You thus want to decarbonize because it's economically more valuable. Again, economic value, the difference between cost of capital and returns, basically just makes your returns go down. You're paying a tax. This is how you disincentivize carbon. The other thing it can do is it can create huge incentives for green businesses. So an example I like to think about is Tesla. Tesla, for electric vehicles, has been revolutionary. The work of Tesla in mainstreaming the use of electric vehicles in America, I think, is one of the biggest changes in US emissions. So the transport sector is the biggest sector for emissions in the United States, and Tesla is leading the way in electric vehicles. I think it's about 2/3 of sales. For the first 10 years of its life, Tesla did not make its money from selling cars. They were loss-making on selling cars. The way they made their money is there was an emissions trading scheme in California that basically taxed you for the emissions your cars produced. And then you could have to buy credits from those companies that created cars without emissions. And so Tesla actually made all its money just from selling these emissions credits because their cars don't produce CO2. And so this was a way of basically subsidizing a good business, Tesla, while penalizing a bad business, internal combustion engines. The problem, though, for developing countries is that they have big distributional impacts. So if you were to remove the fuel subsidies in Indonesia, or you were to, let's say, tax carbon, this would filter through to some extent to consumers. So hopefully we would think that firms and companies would adjust their behavior to be less carbon intensive, but they would probably have to put some of their prices up. And so governments naturally are very, very unwilling, particularly in the global south, where, as we said, the question of the energy transition is not necessarily about lowering emissions as it is about sustainable development. And part of what you need for sustainable development is more energy. And if your carbon tax makes the price of energy go up, it's going to be very, very difficult politically.
So with the net zero 2050, and if you see the global south, average energy price from fossil fuel is only 1/3 of the renewable energy. Is it too optimistic? It's
a great question. So I think one of the things we talk about a lot in my class is what does it mean for a technology to be too expensive? So generally speaking, when someone says, as you just did, and you're correct in a very technical way, the cost of fossil fuels is 1/3 the cost of renewables in certain emerging markets. What people are generally talking about, we don't need to go into it too much because it's quite technical, is something called the levelized cost of energy. And it's basically saying that once you build your renewable energy plant, or you build your gas power plant, your coal power plant, on average, how much money does it cost, including paying back all the upfront investments, including your financing costs, including everything? How much does it cost to produce, let's say, 1 megawatt hour of electricity, which is the unit of electricity? And in certain instances, that number for emerging markets is higher for renewable energy. But if you think about it for a second, that's actually very strange, because your source of energy is free. Your source of energy, the wind, the sun, the heat of the earth, these things are free. And so you have no operating costs, apart from maintaining your plant. You're not paying for fuel. And so how is it that if your source of energy is free, the sun, versus paying quite a lot for gas or paying quite a lot for coal, how did this end up more expensive? And the answer is that it costs a lot of upfront money to build solar fields. There's a lot more what people call capital expenditure, CapEx. You have to buy solar panels, you have to install them, a lot of upfront costs. The second problem is also that you can't use the asset all the time. When you have a coal plant, you put in coal, you burn the coal, you can burn it 24 hours. That means that what's called the utilization of your plant is close to 100%. You're always making money. The cash stream is constant. With the renewable energy field, let's say solar, you only make money when the sun is shining. So we have these two problems. One is high upfront capital costs, and one is low utilization. And both those things, particularly in emerging markets, can drive up the cost of energy for renewables, basically because of the cost of financing. So if your cost of financing is really high, your cost of capital, you've spent so much money building your solar field that the amount of interest you have to pay on your debt is high, and that translates into a high levelized cost of energy. So your question was, do I think these incredibly ambitious renewable targets in places like Indonesia, are they achievable? They are technically achievable. The thing we have to do is make the levelized cost of energy for solar and for wind go down. And the two challenges that we have are the ones I just mentioned: high upfront capital costs and utilization. And there are solutions to these. So in order to bring down the cost of financing, you have to lower the cost of capital. Again, economic value, the difference between cost of capital and return. We have to drive down the cost of capital. Lots of ways we can do this. We can do this with cheap loans from the World Bank. We can do this with carbon credits. We can do this with government subsidies. If the cost of capital in Indonesia or in Vietnam or in Peru was the same as the cost of capital in America, and you could borrow cheap, suddenly renewals become a lot more affordable because you don't have to pay these super high financing costs on your upfront expenditure. The second part, apart from the cost of capital, is utilization, which means we need to be able to be using our solar fields all the time. The problem is at the moment, when the sun is shining in the middle of the day, all of these solar assets are producing electricity, and supply is greater than demand. You're producing more electricity than you can use. And so you don't use all of the electricity, and so you don't sell all of the electricity, and so your revenue goes down. And the way to solve that, there's a couple strategies. In the West, generally speaking, people are focused on what's called long-term energy storage. So saying, okay, we'll overproduce when the sun is shining, we'll use that electricity later, we'll store it in a battery or in something else, and we'll sell it at night. In places like Indonesia, I think actually the solution is maybe simpler, which is to increase transmission. You need to increase the size of the grid. Because Indonesia, very big place, lots of islands, very diverse uses of energy, people using electricity at different times. It's much less correlated than in, let's say, the UK. And also the weather is different. And so if you can spread out via transmission networks both the supply and demand of renewable energy, you don't have this problem of curtailment, which means your utilization goes up. So I just want to sum up all of that in one sentence, which is to say, yes, you have this problem of the cost of energy for renewables is expensive in emerging markets, but it's not because they're less sunny. Indonesia is much more sunny than Germany. The problem is, one, the cost of capital. So we need to lower the cost of capital. And two, utilization of your renewable energy, which means we need to build out the transmission network, which also has the plus side of electrifying the economy and helping with development.
Interesting, because when I oversee some operation in mini hydro in Indonesia, dry season revenue goes down completely. So I think that's a challenge that have to be faced by investors or businessmen in Indonesia for the climate energy transition. Anyway, I want to talk about you more personal about you. You've been shifting from finance and academia, especially in climate change. What drives you?
So I worked in finance for a long time. I was principally focused on sustainable finance. I was focused on infrastructure, and I found that very interesting. I think I spent some time trying to build infrastructure projects in places that it's hard to build infrastructure. And what I realized is that markets are very, very efficient in that they can be relied on to find those opportunities where the returns are greater than the cost of capital. And so if we want to just generally speaking build stuff, and we want to generally speaking create growth, actually markets are really good for that. And so if you look at the golden ages of capitalism in America, or the boom in China after the Deng Xiaoping era, really, really good at creating growth. Amazing. The problem is that my aim, what I'm interested in, our aim as policymakers, our aim as a society is no longer just growth, it's sustainable growth. It's creating more energy usage for Indonesia without creating more emissions. And then it's not quite a market failure. The market's working perfectly. It's just it's not working in the way we want to. And so I was building renewable energy infrastructure and realized that actually the thing that would make this possible is not just markets, it's policy. As we said when we were talking about increasing renewable energy in Indonesia and reaching this very ambitious 2050 net zero target, actually, if you wanted to increase energy use in Indonesia, you would build coal. You would build just much, much, much more coal. And I think that's a problem we have to face, which is that we want everything to be easy. We want that our environmental aims are perfectly aligned with our developmental aims, and they're not. Coal is cheap. Now, ultimately, long term, it would be great if we had a transmission network and we had solar because it's cheaper to operate, electricity prices can eventually go down. But to get there, we need huge investment in, as I said, increasing utilization. That's huge investment in transmission. We need to change this problem where the upfront cost of financing is high. That's blended finance, that's subsidies. And so if we want to channel the power of markets and the power of finance, which is the field I know, it's my trade, it's the thing I learned at Morgan Stanley, the way to do that is policy. And so I got very, very interested in understanding the link between coming up with academic ideas at Harvard, having these translate into policy ideas, let's say through the World Bank or through a government, and then having the private sector take them on. So just on a personal level, one of the things I've done that's been kind of like most fun really and satisfying is, just as an example, a paper I wrote at Harvard in 2022. It was titled Financing the Energy Transition Through Cross-Border Investment. Very, very specific, we don't have to get into it, but it was about creating a new climate finance mechanism based on this thing called Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is supposed to increase cross-border investment. I looked at this, I was at Harvard, and I thought that there was ways in which we could tweak how this international policy is used to increase cross-border investment. I wrote a paper, it's a bunch of words on a page. I went to COP27 in Egypt, I presented it. A few international institutions liked it. I worked with the World Bank for 6 months. It went from being an academic idea purely to a big policy institution thinking about it, the World Bank. Then the private sector saw what we were doing. They said, actually, this is interesting. Maybe we can use this to build stuff. So I started working with E.ON, a German private sector utility, through their climate subsidiary, which is called Seagrass. And now we're building a transmission line in Rwanda. And so in the space of 2 years, we've gone from writing words in an academic paper, to developing policy, to financing and putting steel in the ground for a transmission line. And to me, that's just super exciting, that you can think about interesting things and then pursue them, and things actually happen in the world. And I think also it goes back to your first question about why financing the clean energy transition ended up being such a popular course in a university, because this is all new. We don't really know how to do it. And so every idea, the things we've been talking about, it could be that everything I've said here was completely wrong. This is a completely new field. But that in some ways is also really exciting, because from academia, you get to test out new ideas. There are a lot of fields like, let's say, health policy, urban policy. There's still innovation, but we've been doing them for a very long time. Climate policy is new. And so you're constantly doing policy entrepreneurship. Things like, I'm sure you've heard about the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism that the European Union is now putting in. It's a tax on the embedded emissions of imports. So if you produce steel and you emit CO2, you have to pay the Europeans a tax on those molecules of CO2. The Europeans started phasing it in October of last year, the first carbon border tax ever. So we have no idea what's going to do. And so there's such space for policy innovation. That's basically what excited me and drew me to it.
What do you gonna suggest for the academia in regards to these issues?
But fundamentally, this is a really hard challenge to solve, because governments, as you just said, have limited.
So what you're saying is that the financing clean energy essentially is a mix of finance and policies.
Yes.
Is it possible in developed? I was wondering in global north, is it possible to have sustainable energy without policy interventions, or it still have to?
That's an interesting question. So, in the United States right now, I might be getting the numbers slightly off, but I think about 80 to 85% of new electricity generation coming online is renewable. That is phenomenal. So
85%
of new electricity coming online in the United States is renewable. So unfortunately, this doesn't mean that tomorrow the United States grid is going to be all renewable, in part because assets have a very long life, and so you've got some coal, a lot of gas in the US grid that's going to take a long time to phase out. Also, it might be the case that 85% is sort of an upper limit without new technologies, because you need to balance the grid. You need something called gas peakers. But that is a phenomenal change from just 10 years ago. In part, that's because, when we were talking about the levelized cost of energy, the sun is free. And so ultimately, it does kind of make sense if you just look at it in a vacuum. If you were, an alien looking at Earth, and you'd say, you can either pay for fuel, burn it, and get energy, or you can just take the free energy from the sun. Obviously, the free energy from the sun is a much better idea. You're not paying for fuel costs. And because the cost of financing is much lower in the United States, the risk is lower, you don't have this issue of high upfront financing costs. The thing is, though, that actually renewable energy is extremely subsidized. And there's still about $1.5 trillion of subsidies for fossil fuels in the world. These numbers are actually very hard to calculate. The numbers I'm quoting are from the IMF. About $1.5 trillion of subsidies being paid by governments for the use of fossil fuels. The thing is, actually, the vast majority of that is what's called end use. So unlike in Indonesia, where you directly subsidize the fossil fuel, most fossil fuel subsidies go to electricity. And it just so happens that, because the electricity is generated from fossil fuels, you end up subsidizing carbon emissions. There's much, much more subsidies now in the United States for renewable energy than there is for fossil fuels. Orders of magnitude more, in part because of the IRA. And so I think your question is really valid of, is renewable energy economically viable as a standalone without policy? Maybe an interesting, analysis, but frankly, I don't think it matters, because there are so many policy reasons to support renewable energy. One, this is a growth area. Governments have a duty to help their economies expand. So the IRA is called the Inflation Reduction Act. It's not called the Green Act. First of all, they're trying to reduce inflation, in part through energy prices. Second of all, it's basically industrial policy. They're trying to bring manufacturing jobs home. They're trying to increase good jobs in America. Again, that's nothing to do with green energy. That's to do with industrial policy in the United States. Thirdly, and it's very important, environmental and climate goals. Climate is one of them, but also burning coal is very bad for human health. And so I don't know if renewable energy is completely feasible as a standalone, and I don't think it matters, because there are so many reasons why, from human health to development to jobs to growth, governments should be supporting the energy transition. And so if you look at how we got to where we are today in terms of the fossil fuel economy, that wasn't standalone. We had huge fossil fuel subsidies. We had government investment in securing the oil network. There's a whole other area of thinking about climate geopolitics and what the United States has done over the last century to secure access to oil for American companies. Something called the Carter Doctrine about security in the Straits in the Middle East. And so, no, I don't know if the renewable energy transition could happen in developed economies on its own, but I don't think it matters.
Sure, because definitely policymakers in Indonesia has challenges in balancing the fiscal space that they have, much smaller, and to be creative in terms of how to give subsidies and balancing it with growth. What can you suggest the policymakers or your students who are going to be the policymakers in our countries?
Yeah. I think the first thing I would say is to accept that actually there is a trade-off. I think that in the way that the media talks about climate change, we like to think it's actually a really easy solution that is being held up by, crony capitalism or the interests of oil companies or something like this. And, to some extent, like everyone has interests and there's a lot of things going on that we don't want. But fundamentally, this is a really hard challenge to solve because governments, as you just said, have limited what we call fiscal space. They don't have enough money. And so they have lots of different policy aims. And if your aim is to increase energy access, or your aim is to increase growth, or your aim is to reduce emissions, you are going to do three different things. And so I think the first thing to note is that you have to figure out what your priority is as a government. The second is that there are sort of two levels of analysis. There's how do you make a private sector project work? So again, in my class, we're given a private sector model, and I tell the students, you need to make the returns high enough to justify the private sector investment. The easiest way to do that would be a huge grant. Like if you just give a grant to the project, the returns are going to go up. Or a huge subsidy on, let's say, the price of electricity, or a huge tax break. So at the level of the project, at the level of increasing the energy transition, mechanically, we actually really know what would help. Money, making the return go up, making the cost of capital go down. The problem is, and then this is why we have to think about this not just as a financial issue, but as a policy issue, governments don't have the money to do that. And there's also ramifications. So let's say you spend your money increasing electric vehicle penetration. A lot of government revenue comes from fuel tax. And so if electric vehicle penetration goes up, the amount of money that the government can charge on fuel tax goes down. This is a problem for government revenue. And so thinking about it sort of as a general equilibrium and saying, how can I best use my government resources most effectively so that I shift as much of the burden from public subsidies to the private sector? So let's say you decide that you have $10 to spend on decarbonizing your economy, or $10 million or $10 billion. What you want to know is the amount of money that needs to be spent in total, much more than 10 billion. It could be 20 billion, it could be 30 billion. And so I think the key question that I try and get my students to understand is how can we be the word we would use is catalytic. How can we catalyze? How can we crowd in as many private sector dollars for every public sector dollar we spend in order to shift the burden of decarbonizing from the public to the private sector? Which means in some senses, doing things we might not find sort of aesthetically pleasing. This means making it profitable for the private sector to invest in our countries, which often means subsidizing the private sector because they have much, 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 much more money than governments. The amount of private sector assets dwarfs the amount of government budgets. And so we need to say, if we're a government, how can we use our limited resources most effectively to shift the burden, the financial burden, from government coffers onto private sector balance sheets?
So technically, from finance perspective, it's all the same, right? Like financing, all of other objects of investment is all the same. My last question: what do you gonna suggest for the academia in regards to these issues?
It's an interesting question. I think it goes back to what I was saying previously, that this is a new era, a new sector. People have been talking about pricing carbon for decades. We've figured out economic models of carbon prices. We've thought about the most effective way to use subsidies. But for the first time now, we have a lot of political capital, a lot of momentum to complement what's going on in academia and to complement all these ideas. So I think, to me, it's a super exciting time for people studying policy. And I guess I'll answer in my role as an instructor at the Kennedy School. It's a super exciting time for people that want to enter the field because we're still testing everything out. It's sort of like a laboratory. Again, like I think the best example is the CBAM, this carbon border tax the Europeans are implementing. We don't know how it's going to affect Indonesia. We don't know if it's going to encourage Indonesia to decarbonize quicker so they can export to the EU, or we don't know if it's going to push Indonesia away from exporting to the EU and exporting to China because they don't have a carbon tax. And so there's all these unintended consequences that we don't actually really know the impacts in the real world because we've never had the data to observe how these policies play out. And so I think my thought would be basically the more people thinking about these challenges, the better. And people should come to Harvard and take my class.
All right, that's Ely Sandler with Financing Clean Energy Transition. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ely.
Thank you so much. It was great.
This is another for us.
Thanks. Cool.